Okay.
Okay, so we're going to cover Carl Jung and his writings on the Book of Job. He wrote this in the early 50s. It's called Answer to Job, and it's one of his seminal works. It's probably the only thing he wrote on organized religion. On the other hand, the Book of Job doesn't really fit into it stands alone by itself. It doesn't really fit in to the Old Testament, but that's what it is. So here we go. We're going to go. Why doesn't it want to go? Here we go. You want to read this?
So this begins a synopsis of the book of Job. And this is Jung's interpretation of this. The book of Job is a book of wisdom literature that explores the question of why a righteous person would suffer when they have done nothing to deserve it. The narrative challenges the conventional view that suffering is always a direct punishment for sin. The wager,
There are three key events. Go ahead.
In the biblical story, the wager, the suffering, and the dialogue. So in a heavenly scene, God points out the righteousness of his servant, Job. Satan, Hebrew for the accuser, who is part of the heavenly court, argues that Job is only loyal because God has blessed him with wealth and family. Satan bets God that if Job's prosperity were taken away, he would curse God. Then we have phase two is the suffering. God allows Satan to take everything from Job except his life. Sound familiar? In rapid succession, Job loses all his livestock, servants, and 10 children. He is then afflicted with terrible, painful sores from head to toe. Despite his immense grief, Job refuses to curse God. The dialogue then involves three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to comfort Job. They sit in silence for 7 days before a long poetic debate begins. The friends insist that Job must have committed some sin to deserve such a severe punishment. But Job steadfastly maintains his innocence and questions God's justice.
So here we go to God's response. Eventually, God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. He does not provide an explanation for the suffering, but instead challenges Job with a series of rhetorical questions about the complexity and the power of his creation, including descriptions of fearsome beasts like Behemoth and Leviathan. And then we have the resolution. Humbled by the encounter and his own limited understanding, Job repents of his narrow thinking. God then admonishes Job's friends for their inaccurate explanations and restores Job's health, giving him twice the wealth he had before and a new family. Of course, it doesn't say what happened to the old family. So the conclusion is that the reasons for suffering are often beyond human comprehension. True faith involves trusting in God's sovereignty, even in the midst of adversity and without receiving a clear explanation. So there you have it. It's a little strange. So this is what Jung picked up on. Job becomes morally superior to Yahweh. This is not something that might jump at you. In his book, Answer to Job, Jung makes a provocative and highly controversial claim. Job, the mortal human, becomes morally superior to Yahweh. And this superior is not based on power, but on consciousness. Jung argues that Job's suffering creates a moral gap between the creator and the creature, which is Job, which effectively forces the hand of the divine. The paradox of the unconscious creator. Jung views the Yahweh of the Old Testament as an antinomian force, a being of infinite power, but zero self-reflection. So Yahweh is everything at once, total light and total darkness. Because he's everything, he has no other to reflect against, rendering him psychologically unconscious. So the injustice is when Yahweh allows Satan to ruin Job's life for a bet, he is acting out his own internal shadow. This is Jung's nomenclature here. So the reflection here is that Job, through his suffering, looks back at God and sees this injustice. Job realizes that God is not moral in a human sense, but is simply a blind force of nature. So we have Job's moral superiority to Yahweh. Jung argues because Job experiences the agony of the contradiction, being a righteous man punished by a righteous God, he achieves a level of ethic awareness that God himself lacks. Job realizes God's inner antinomy, and in light of this realization, his consciousness undergoes a decisive change. So by remaining steadfast in his integrity while acknowledging the monstrosity of God's power, Job holds up a mirror to the divine. And Jung posits, once a creature becomes more conscious than its creator, the creator is defeated by the creature's awareness. So there's a necessity here for incarnation. This is really the turning point in Jung's psychological history of God. Jung suggests God cannot remain inferior to his own creation. I mean, how could you be God? Once Job's consciousness has surpassed Yahweh's, the divine is forced into a process of evolution. First is the need to become human. To regain moral standing and to understand what it means to be a victim of existence, God must become human. And this incarnation, Jung interprets as the coming of Christ, as God's apology or response to Job. By becoming man, as in Jesus or Yeshua, God experiences the same suffering and abandonment, the "my God, why have you forsaken me," that Yeshua said on the cross, that he inflicted on Job. So the integration here is that through this process of incarnation, God moves from being a blind, amoral force to a conscious, self-aware being.
I want to say it's the beginning of the breakdown of the absolute unity.
Right.
There begins to be some other.
Right. But because Yahweh has everything, he doesn't realize that what in the world is going on here. He doesn't have a mirror. Job holds up a mirror to him and says, "See what you're missing." And God goes, "You're right." You want to read this?
For Jung, this process didn't end with the New Testament. He believed the answer to Job is an ongoing psychological event within the human psyche. We are still integrating the divine shadow today. In this sense, humans are the vessel through which the divine becomes conscious of itself.
So Jung, again, the shadow is the dark side of things. So now let's go back to Jung's work in his book and his answer to Job, where he draws a direct parallel between his concept of archetypes and Plato's theory of forms. Remember what Plato saw, where there are these perfect forms. And when we for example, draw a circle, we don't draw a perfect circle. We know what a perfect circle is. but we can't draw it because we'll make mistakes. We'll have jagged edges. It won't be perfect in that sense. But that's what the theory of forms is. These forms are in another space, and what it looks like is this is what Ron Cowan saw. They're in this space that's controlled by the algorithms, that is the information that coats all of the compartments of space itself. So it's everywhere. That's where it lies.
They're the models. That's right. Another word for like the prototype or the model or the ideal.
Right. And so it's a way to think about where in the world are these forms residing. So Jung viewed the archetypes as the psychic equivalent of Platonic forms. That is, your psyche resonates with them. You have other types of Platonic forms. For example, in mathematics, you have the integers, 1, 2, 3. That's a special sort of thing, a special concept that just magically appears. We all know what it is. Where did it come from? And then we have in music, Platonic forms and so forth. So they're everywhere. So there's a universal inherited pattern of thought and behavior that exists in this collective unconscious, or in what Ron Cowan called information, rather than in a separate spiritual realm. So it's all around us. So we have a little psychological shift here. We have features here, which we're going to go through in a second, and we have pre-Job when we have Yahweh. So Yahweh is there in these all-powerful, etc. Then we have Job, which is the turning point for Yahweh, and then we have the result, which is post-Job. So let's look at this. The first thing we come up with is Yahweh pre-Job is unconscious but all-powerful. The turning point with Job is he's conscious but powerless. Job is going through incredible misery, courtesy of Satan, courtesy of the shadow. But this is something that the all-powerful God can do nothing about. And so the result post-Job is that God is conscious, but chooses to incarnate, to experience what in the world he was missing here. There's the morality side of things. Pre-Job, Yahweh was amoral and contradictory. He was able to have both good and evil reside in him and was completely indifferent or immoral about any of this. With Job, the turning point, all of a sudden, you had to be ethically consistent. Here, Job lost everything, but he still said, I still love God. So he was ethically consistent. And the result for Yahweh was he had to reconcile all this through Christ, through becoming Christ, and then incarnating what Christ experienced.
And that was in order to experience limitation. Before, when everything was totally unified, there was no limitation. That was one of the main things about the God image, was that it was all powerful and limitless and all one. And if everything's all one, there's no other. So you can't even have experience, because you can't have someone experiencing something other than itself. It's just all one unity.
But he was able to experience it through Christ, because Christ was mortal, was incarnated, and dealt with humans, and then was crucified. And so all of these things were new to Yahweh. So the role we have here is that pre-Job, Yahweh was the blind creator. He didn't really pay attention. He was blind. But when Job showed up, Job was holding a mirror up to God and saying, look, you're not really being moral. Look what I'm suffering. And this led post-Job to the self-aware divinity of Yahweh. he realized now that I was missing something all along and I should have paid attention. So here we have archetypes versus Platonic forms. The archetypes, what Job talked about, the Platonic forms is what Plato talked about. Both these concepts describe universal blueprints, but they differ in location and function. Archetypes for Jung are described as common cultural memes or psychic archetypes that are stored in the collective unconscious. So unlike Plato's static ideal forms, Jung's archetypes are dynamic and manifest through dreams, myths, and individual actions. And this is probably what Ron Cowan would agree with, because you can have these algorithms in the information that create these archetypes, and the algorithms change, they evolve. You started at some place, but then things change over time. So the forms for Plato always represented the perfect non-material essence of all things, and Jung acknowledged this commonality and suggested the archetypes are the perfect, purest form of ideals that remain transcendent until they are concretized. See if I can get this out of the way. No, I can't. By human experience. Here we go. So I'm able to do it. Okay.
The infinite needed the experience of finiteness to have experience at all.
Right.
And to have the growth that comes with experience. So it's paradoxical.
Right.
Because to say that God needed growth means that he wasn't all things. He wasn't infinite.
Right.
He didn't represent every possibility until he could experience
incarnation.
And that's finiteness, and
Right.
that's limitation, which was the human experience that was giving Job that edge,
right,
in terms of development.
Right. So here's the archetypal drama that Jung put together in his book, Answer to Job. Jung interpreted the biblical story not as literal history, but really as a divine drama, manifesting archetypal shifts in the human relationship with the divine. So the human changed and the divine changed in both these. The shadow of God, Jung identifies a dark side or the shadow in the archetype of Yahweh and argues in the book of Job, Yahweh is an amoral force of nature who's unconscious of his own internal contradictions. That's why he made the bet in the first place with Satan. He didn't even realize that he had this as an issue. It took Satan to point it out as his dark side. So Job, as the archetype of consciousness, represents the emerging human consciousness or the ego that is confronting the overwhelming power of the unconscious, which is the self or God. And Jung posits Job becomes morally superior to Yahweh because he recognizes the injustice that God himself is blind to. I mean, how could God ever go ahead and do what Satan did to Job? That's incredible injustice. Then we have the quaternity. Jung suggests that the Christian Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is an incomplete archetype because it lacks a feminine or an evil element. So he proposes a quaternity to include these missing parts, and viewing events like the Assumption of Mary as the archetypal integration of the feminine into the divine. So Jung always liked to balance things. You could think of a cross with four different points, but they're actually two lines, and they give you extremes on each of the two lines. And so his quaternity would do that. That's what he liked about it. So we have Satan in the shadow. In Carl Jung's interpretation of the book of Job, Satan is not an external enemy of God, but he's actually part of Yahweh. He's Yahweh's own shadow, the personification of his shadow. And so Jung uses this relationship to illustrate how a powerful, all-encompassing psyche can remain unconscious of its own destructive potential by having all this stuff done to Job, which was terrible. So Satan is the unconscious other. We have three things here: the internal antagonist, the catalyst for suffering, and a mirror for human integration. So the first one, the internal antagonist, Jung argues in the beginning of the book of Job, Satan is one of the sons of God. He represents a functional part of the divine psyche, acts as the doubting thought, the critical eye that Yahweh is not yet integrated into his own self-awareness. That's the internal antagonist. The catalyst for suffering is by bamboozling or provoking Yahweh into testing Job. Satan forces the hidden immoral side of God to the surface. Jung believed this shows Yahweh is unconscious of his own internal contradictions. He's a monster of pure energy who cannot see his own back. And this allows Job to become a mirror for human integration. Jung posits because Yahweh is unconscious, he projects his own flaws onto humanity. So Satan serves as the container for these disowned traits, demonstrating the Jungian rule that what is not made conscious will eventually confront us as fate or an external devil. And then we have this movement toward wholeness or quaternity. So Jung used the figure of Satan to critique the Holy Trinity, which he felt was psychologically incomplete because it lacked a representation of darkness. So Jung proposed a four-part structure. The missing fourth part would be both feminine, the Sophia or Mary piece, and dark, the Satan piece. And in this evolutionary shift in the answer to Job, Jung suggested after the moral scandal of Job's suffering, God is forced to become conscious and eventually incarnates as Christ to reconcile with humanity. But Jung warns the split between a purely good Christ and a purely evil Satan remains a dangerous psychological dualism, since until both of them are integrated back into the single whole image of self. So we go to the book of Revelation. In Jung's book, Answer to Job, the book of Revelation represents the catastrophic return of the repressed. Jung argues the radical focus on love and light during the life of Christ created a massive psychological imbalance in the divine image, which eventually bursts forth as the terrifying visions of the apocalypse that you have in the book of Revelation. And we have the dissociation of the divine. You want to read this?
Okay. I wanted to point out that one of the most favorite commentators on this book of Jung's is, I forget his first name.
David.
Edinger.
Yeah, Edinger.
And the subtitle of his book was
it was Transformation.
Transformation of the God image.
Yeah, right.
Which is exactly what this is. And he's talking about that as a form of evolution along with human consciousness. That as we evolve, so does the image of God, which isn't just an internal fantasy. It transcends that as well. So it's creating us, and we're creating it. So Jung posits that when God became man in Jesus, he identified exclusively with his light side, becoming a God of pure love, mercy, and perfection. The suppressed shadow side, by focusing only on the good, the dark, wrathful aspect of the old Yahweh, the shadow, was not integrated but merely pushed aside. In Satan's exile in the New Testament, Satan is cast out of heaven, which Jung interprets as a psychological dissociation where the evil element of the Godhead is severed rather than reconciled.
Yeah.
And I say to have a whole image of God, it's got to have both because it's capable of both.
Right.
If you try to idealize it, oh, well, it's all good. We just don't understand it yet. I don't know. That's not satisfying to me.
Yeah. No, and Jung was always looking for yin and yang, for balances everywhere. If he didn't see it, he said something's missing. You have to look around and see what's missing. This is a perfect example. So Jung used the Greek term enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites, to explain the revelation. The compensatory vision here is this. Compensatory vision is John of Patmos, who wrote the book of Revelation, is the same John who wrote the epistles, emphasizing that God is love. And Jung argued that John's extreme one-sidedness forced his unconscious to produce a compensation in the form of a bloodthirsty, vengeful vision. So the wrathful Christ shows up. In Revelation, the gentle Lamb of God becomes a warrior who strikes down nations and fills the world with seething lakes of fire. This is the shadow of Christ reemerging to reestablish the balance that was lost. Again, you see Jung here looking for the flip side. So the Antichrist is the other half. For Jung, the prediction of an Antichrist is a psychological necessity. To achieve wholeness, the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, must acknowledge a fourth element, the shadow or Satan, which also includes this feminine side of things.
Well, naturally.
Yeah. And so the final integration is the catastrophe of Revelation, is the divine psyche's violent attempt to become whole again. It serves as a warning. If we do not consciously integrate our own shadows, they'll eventually manifest as a collective destructive apocalypse in the physical world. So here's a little summary table. We have an aspect here, which is the Gospels. That's the thesis. So the Gospels are the thesis. Then the antithesis is the book of Revelation. The Gospels talk about love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself. Revelation is just death and destruction. There's the God image. In the Gospels, God is light and love. In the book of Revelation, God is hellfire, brimstone, wrath. We have the notion of Christ. In the Gospels, Christ is the suffering servant. In the book of Revelation, Christ is the vengeful judge. He wreaks havoc. In the psychology side of things, the gospel has a repression of the shadow. It's very much focused on love, love, love. In the book of
light.
And light. In the book of Revelation, we have the explosion of the shadow. So the shadow is anything but suppressed in the book of Revelation. So in going into the final chapters of the answer to Job, Jung moved from biblical analysis to a chillingly practical application for the modern world. Remember, this is in the early 50s. And so the US had developed an atomic bomb, 1945, and then the Russians had one in 1949. And so Jung is quite aware of this. And he's arguing now that the psychological drama of God's evolution is no longer happening up there in the heavens, but it's now happening down here on Earth within human technology and politics. To Jung, the atomic age is the literal manifestation of the divine shadow finally falling into the hands of man. If you want to get wiped out in a nuclear fireball, that you get your wish here. So the withdrawal of the projection. Let me make sure I got this. Yeah. Historically, humans projected the power of creation and destruction onto God. We believed that only a deity could end the world or command the fire of the sun. But with the discovery of nuclear fission, Jung argues that this projection has been withdrawn. We've quite literally pulled the power of God out of the sky and placed it in our own laboratories. So there are consequences. Man is a demigod. Humans now possess the divine power to destroy all life on Earth. And on top of this is a lack of moral evolution. Jung's great fear was that while our technical power became godlike, our moral consciousness remained stuck in a primitive and unintegrated state. And so having everyone die in nuclear war would be a highly likely outcome. Carrying the shadow of God. Jung suggests that because God, as a psychological archetype, has become more conscious through this incarnation, we have the tension of opposites, the conflict between absolute good and absolute evil. And it now resides within the individual human being. We have a burden of choice. In the past, God's will was responsible for catastrophe. Now the decision to trigger an apocalypse rests on the shoulders of just a few human individuals. This is not a mass thing, but everyone will suffer. And we have the incarnatio continua. Jung proposes the continuous incarnation, meaning God is constantly being born into human consciousness. We're no longer just servants of God, we're the carriers of God's own unresolved contradictions. But Jung's answer to this threat of the atomic age is not political or social, it's psychological. He argues that the only thing standing between humanity and nuclear annihilation is the individual's ability to integrate their own shadow. The world hangs on a thin thread. That thread is the psyche of man. So if we do not recognize the shadow or Satan within ourselves, we'll project it onto other nations. It's very easy for the people in the US to hate the Russians and for the Russians to hate the US. This was the Cold War that Jung saw. But there's a micro apocalypse. By facing our own capacity for evil, we depressurize the collective shadow, preventing it from exploding into a literal global apocalypse. But of course, you have to face it. If you don't face it, you end up with apocalypse. So again, a little table to summarize this. We have a basic concept, which we're going to come to. They're in the column here. And we have the pre-modern view before the atomic bomb, and then in the atomic age view, according to Jung. So we have the source of apocalypse, the pre-modern view. Oh, that had to come externally. It was due to God, some sort of, we read in the book of Revelations of a day of judgment. But now that we're in the atomic age, Jung said, actually, this is a human decision. It's internal. And if you want to have an apocalypse, have a nuclear war, that'll do it. We have the shadow. Well, in the pre-modern view, that was cast out as Satan. Easy to understand. In the atomic age view, it's integrated as a human potential. The shadow is now part of humanity. We have the human role. In the pre-modern view, man was always obedient subject to God. In the atomic age view, there's a conscious vessel of the divine, which is man. Very different. The divine is integrated. There's a solution to evil. Before the atomic age, it was prayer and piety. But after the atomic bomb, we had self-knowledge and shadow work. Okay, we have to deal with these things. This requires heavy-duty work. So the final thought here is that Jung concludes, we are lived by powers we do not understand. The answer to Job is that man must become conscious enough to hold the tension of the world's opposites within himself so that God acting through us, does not destroy his own creation once again. Now, there was a 1950 proclamation by the Catholic Church of the Assumption of Mary. And the Assumption of Mary was, according to Catholic dogma, that Mary, the Mother of God, was taken body and soul into heaven. And this was proclaimed in 1950, so it was viewed as one of the most significant religious events since the Reformation. So to Jung, this wasn't about theology. It was a psychological emergency response from the collective unconscious to the hyper-masculine destructive energy of the atomic age. It's an attempt to try and include some balance here of women in this. So rebalancing the divine gender. Do you want to try this?
Jung argued that the Western God image had become dangerously one-sided. Masculine, intellectual, to sky god, definitely, and power-oriented. This masculine archetype, when disconnected from the feminine, tends toward abstraction, completion, competition, and eventually total destruction, symbolized by the atomic bomb. The Trinity to the Quaternity. By elevating Mary to heaven, Jung saw the Trinity evolving into a quaternity. The missing element in Jungian psychology, the number 3 is unstable, while the number 4 represents wholeness and stability. Adding the feminine element, Mary provided the earth and matter needed to ground the fire and spirit of the masculine Godhead.
So matter is no longer evil. In traditional Platonic and early Christian thought, spirit was good, and matter, or the body, was often seen as a source of sin or corruption. Jung saw the atomic age as the ultimate crisis of this split. Man used spirit, science, and intellect to blow up matter, which is the earth. There's a body in heaven. The fact that Mary was assumed body and soul into heaven was crucial for Jung. It signaled a psychological shift where physical reality and feminine principle were finally given divine status. And then there's an antidote for this. By making the feminine material divine, the psyche created a counterweight to the destructive impulse. If matter is sacred, we're less likely to treat the world as a mere laboratory for nuclear destruction. So Sophia and the marriage in heaven. Jung linked Mary, the mother of Yeshua, to the ancient figure of Sophia, or wisdom. He believed the Assumption represented a heavenly marriage, hieros gamos, the birth of the third thing. From this union of opposites, male, female, spirit and matter, heaven and earth, a new kind of consciousness could be born. And this is the protection of life. Jung believed that the feminine archetype is inherently related and preserving, while the masculine shadow of God, meaning Satan or the nuclear bomb, seeks to divide and destroy. The feminine archetype seeks to bind and protect. And again, a little chart to summarize some of this stuff. The psychological function of the Assumption. So you have aspects in the first column, and then the atomic masculine aspect showing up here, and the Mary feminine or antidote showing up here. So let's look at energy. For energy, it deals with, on the atomic masculine side, with expansion, fission, and force. The counter to that, the Mary feminine, is containment, fusion, and relationship. We have focus. Focus here is going to be abstract logic and destruction for the atomic masculine. But for the Mary feminine, it's going to be physical reality, not abstract logic, and preservation, not destruction. And then the structure here, the atomic masculine, we have a trinity, but 3 is incomplete, Jung believes. And what we really needed was a quaternity, a wholeness. We need the number 4. So the end result in the atomic or masculine side is apocalypse or annihilation. But for the feminine side, it's incarnation and integration. So Jung's concluding thought here, for Mary, the assumption of Mary was a symbolic bridge built by the collective unconscious to save humanity from its own one-sidedness. He believed unless we integrated this feminine wisdom, valuing life, body, and earth as much as power and intellect, the shadow of God unleashed in the atomic age would surely consume us. And you could see, given all the things that we've seen going through the atomic age, we came very close to frying everybody multiple times.
We may be on the verge of that again.
Yeah. Want to try this?
Answer to Job and synchronicity. Jung published Answer to Job and his seminal essay on synchronicity at nearly the same time, in the span of 1951 to 52. For Jung, these were not separate interests. They were two sides of the same coin. He believed that when the human psyche undergoes a massive shift, like the one triggered by the atomic age and the superior consciousness of the modern individual, the physical world often responds with meaningful coincidences.
Or synchronicities. So we have a break in causality. Synchronicity is defined by Jung as an acausal connecting principle. It suggests the mind or the psyche and the matter or physis are not separate, but are two aspects of a single underlying reality, which Jung called one world or unus mundus. There's an atomic link here. Jung noted that just as physicists were discovering subatomic particles don't always follow cause and effect. This is what is called quantum indeterminacy. The human psyche was experiencing a similar breakdown of traditional structures. And this leads to a mirror effect. Jung interpreted global events not just as political causes, but as physical reflections of the inner psychological state of humanity. The external threat of the bomb was synchronous with the internal threat of the unintegrated shadow. So we have dogma and the spirit of the age. Jung saw the 1950 proclamation of the Assumption of Mary by the Catholic Church as a synchronistic response to the Cold War. He felt it was a psychic necessity. Jung argued it was no coincidence that the Catholic Church, an institution usually resistant to any change, felt an inner necessity to elevate the feminine precisely when the world was threatened by masculine nuclear annihilation. And there's the spirit of the time, or the zeitgeist. To Jung, this wasn't a calculated move by the Pope, but a manifestation of the collective unconscious, pushing a specific archetype into reality to balance the scales of fate. Then we have UFOs as a synchronistic phenomenon. The world in the late 40s and 50s became obsessed with flying saucers, unidentified flying objects, UFOs. So Jung wrote a book on this, Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. And he viewed it as a massive synchronistic event. There was a mandala in the sky. Jung noted that the UFOs are usually described as circular or disc-shaped. So in Jungian terms, the circle is a mandala, the archetype of self and wholeness. And this is all in response to fragmentation, because the atomic age threatened to tear the world apart. The collective psyche projected images of wholeness into the sky. Whether the UFOs are physically real was less important to Jung than the fact that they appeared meaningfully at a time of global fragmentation. So the individual's role in global synchronicity. Jung believed that as the individual does the shadow work described in his interpretation of Job, They change the charge of the collective unconscious. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact, two chemical substances. If there's any reaction, both are transformed. So if enough individuals integrate their internal God shadow, Jung suggests the synchronistic luck of humanity might change. Instead of a meaningful coincidence leading to a nuclear accident or apocalypse, a different kind of synchronicity might lead to a breakthrough in human relations or spiritual insight. So here's a summary of this: synchronicity and global shifts. So we have the phenomenon, first of all, of nuclear fission. This was splitting the atom. This was actually observed in 1938. There was a psychic meaning, though, which was it was a fragmented or dissociated psyche. Then we have the UFO sightings. Those occurred all through history, but especially in the 40s and 50s, there were discs in the skies, and the psychic meaning was an archetype of wholeness, a disc. The Assumption of Mary led to new religious dogma, and this led to an integration of the feminine with matter. And the Cold War led to a global standoff, but the psychic meaning was an external projection of the shadow. Hatred goes all around. Very easy to hate. So Jung's ultimate message was the meaningful coincidences of the 1950s were a warning. The universe is no longer an outside thing happening to us. We're deeply entangled with the universe, which takes us to the collaboration of Jung and Pauli. You want to read this?
The collaboration between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli took place from 1930 to 1957. Pauli was one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. He's one of the most remarkable interdisciplinary marriages of the 20th century. Pauli, a Nobel laureate known for the Pauli exclusion principle, sought Jung's help after a mental breakdown. Over 25 years, they realized that the strange behavior of atoms and the strange behavior of the unconscious were actually describing the same reality.
So there is the discovery that the physicists came up with was there is no objective observer. If you have an observer, the observer changes everything. And the example of this was seen in this double slit experiment that we talked about many times. And Ron observed that if you had electrons and you were shooting them through a small slit in foil, they would all go through and line up perfectly. But if you had two slits that were very close to one another and you shot electrons at it, then you'd end up with a wave interference pattern instead of having two lines of electrons that are going through each of the two slits. So by you observing this, that's what happened. The electrons changed from matter to a wave. And you caused it. So they did all kinds of experiments to try and show this. They slowed things down. They shot very slowly, 1 electron a second. It didn't matter. The results were always the same. So the observer influenced the outcome. So the most significant link that Pauli brought to Jung was the end of classical objectivity. It was always assumed the observer had no impact. There was whatever happened, happened. In the quantum physics, the act of observation changes the behavior. And there's a psychological link here. Jung realized this is exactly what happened in the psyche. You can't observe an archetype without your own consciousness affecting its manifestations. They're linked. What you're doing in your head and your client, when you each have a particular archetype, you're joined together consciously. So the result is that mind and matter are not two different things, but two ways of looking at one underlying reality. And this led them to call this the unus mundus, or the one world. And so Pauli provided Jung with the hard science to back up his theory of archetypes. And Pauli noticed that certain patterns in physics, like the fourfold structure of the atom or the symmetry of crystals, mirrored the mandalas and the quaternities that Jung found in the dreams of his patients. And there was an atomic quaternity. Pauli helped Jung see that the number 4 was not just a religious symbol, like the Assumption of Mary, but a fundamental organizing principle of the physical universe. So he had a blueprint here where they hypothesized the archetypes are psychophysical. They exist as patterns in the mind and as laws in the physical universe. What Ron Cowan would say is the information that he saw actually controlled the universe. That is, the laws that we see are actually a result of these algorithms controlling all the forces that we see here in the universe around us. So without Pauli, Jung might have never published this theory on synchronicity. Pauli provided the mathematical and physical framework to explain how an acausal event could even be possible. But just as light is both a wave and a particle, complementarity here, how could it be a wave and a particle? Jung and Pauli proposed that reality is a psychophysical continuum. And they argued that meaning acts as a connecting principle in the same way that gravity or electromagnetism acts in physics. When a person experiences synchronicity, it's a break in the physical world that allows the underlying unity, the unus mundi, how do I get this thing out of the way, to shine through. So there's a radioactivity of the archetype. Pauli and Jung discussed the idea that when a powerful archetype is activated, like the shadow of God in the atomic age, it acts like a radioactive element. There's contamination, just as radiation spreads and affects everything around it. An activated archetype contaminates the environment, causing strange coincidences, dreams, even physical malfunctions. And Pauli, of course, was famous for his Pauli effect, where laboratory equipment would simply explode when he entered a room. The responsibility now is this collaboration reinforced Jung's belief that we don't contain the radioactive power of our own shadows. That energy will inevitably decay into the physical world as a literal atomic destruction. You'll get what you wish for. And so we have another little chart here to just summarize this. The concept here, we have the classical view from Newton, and then the Jung and Pauli view, which is very quantum and archetypal. So the concept of mind versus matter, the classical view was mind and matter are separate and distinct. Jung and Pauli, they're two sides of the same coin. They're the unus mundi. Mundus. There's causality. In classical physics, everything has a physical cause. There's a cause, there's effect. But Jung and Pauli, some events are linked by meaning or synchronicity. There's the observer. Classical view, the observer has nothing, doesn't affect anything, it's totally detached. But Jung and Pauli, the observer is part of the experiment. In fact, the observer is a mirror of the experiment. Then we have archetypes. In the classical view, these are just cultural ideas. But for Jung and Pauli, they're fundamental laws of both the mind and physics. These are the algorithms that Ron Cowan saw in his information. So through Jung and Pauli, Jung was able to formalize the idea that at the deepest level, the universe is neither mental nor physical, but it's neutral. And this gave Jung the confidence to claim in the answer to Job that the evolution of God's consciousness was not just a religious story, but a reflection of the very physics of existence. Now, Jung analyzed Pauli's dreams, and he had a dream of a world clock. This is one of the most famous in all of the literature of Jung. and it occurred to Wolfgang Pauli during his analysis. And it's detailed in Jung's book on psychology and alchemy. But for Jung, this dream was the empirical proof that the human psyche contains a blueprint for the universe, a bridge between the atomic, which is Pauli's world, and the archetypal world, which is Jung's world, the world of the psyche. So what is this world clock? In the dream, Pauli saw a complex, three-dimensional clockwork mechanism. It consisted of two distinct circles. So the clock is three-dimensional, but it has two distinct circles. There's a horizontal circle, which is a golden ring divided into four parts. This is the quaternity, and a bird stood on it. That's the horizontal circle. Then there's a vertical circle. This is a black ring. It's also divided into four parts, but it's rotating at a different rhythm. So the global movement is the two circles are held together by a golden ring and supported by a dark figure. The clock was not just a timepiece, it was a representation of the unus mundus, the unified source of mind and matter.
You can find an image of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So Jung interpreted this. He was stunned by this dream of Pauli because it appeared to be a modern technological version of an ancient mandala. We have the integration of the four, the fact that both circles were divided into four, reinforced Jung's theory that the four of the quaternity is the number of completion. It was the answer to the unstable trinity, integrating the missing fourth, the feminine, the shadow, the matter. But we have time and eternity. The horizontal circle represented the passing of time, which is our physical reality, while the vertical circle represented eternity. This is the realm of the archetype. The world clock showed how these two dimensions are locked together in a single synchronous pulse. And we have a neutral center. At the very center of the clock was nothingness, or a point of balance. Jung and Pauli saw this as the self, the point where the observer and the observed, the physicist and the atom, became one. So what is the synchronicity with quantum physics? Well, Pauli, as a physicist, saw in this dream a symbolic representation of spin and symmetry. That's because he's been thinking about this all his life. But rhythmic harmony in quantum mechanics, particles have spin and distinct states of existence. And the dream suggested the universe operates on a rhythm that is both mathematical, that's the physics side, and meaningful, that's the psychology side. So the observer and the machine, Pauli realized the dark figure supporting the clock was the observer, the human consciousness that carries the weight of reality. And this mirrored his work in physics, where the observer choice determines which aspect of a particle is in fact revealed. So there you have it. So the world clock mattered for the answer to Job. It provided the geometric model for the evolution of God, which is described in the answer to Job. We go from chaos to order. The shadow of God is chaotic, amoral power of the atom. Then the world clock is the regulating principle that keeps that power in check. But we have the pulse of history. Jung used the image of the clock to argue that historical shifts, like the moves of the atomic age, are not accidents. They're ticks of a cosmic clock, the collective unconscious moving through a predetermined cycle of archetypal activation. Now here's a whole bunch of follow-up on this world clock. We have components. We have the golden circle, that's the horizontal one. We have the black circle, that's the vertical one. We have the number 4, and we have the tick and the pulse. Those are all the components here. So the psychological meaning of these, the golden circle is the conscious or spiritual world. The black circle is the unconscious or shadow or matter world. The number 4 shows up for wholeness, or the quaternity, and the tick pulse, it gives us the synchronicity for everything. But now the physical or scientific meaning of the golden circle is it's the macrocosm. Here, the physical scientific meaning of the golden circle, the macrocosm, deals with things like special relativity. We have the black circle, which is the microcosm, or that's the realm of quantum mechanics. We have the number 4, which gives us symmetry, but we have 4 dimensions for space and time. And we have the tick pulse, which shows up in quantum mechanics as the wave function or the frequency of how things fluctuate. So the world clock was the final piece for Jung and Pauli. It suggested if we can understand the rhythm of our own psyche, our internal psyche, we can align ourselves with the rhythm of the physical universe and potentially avoid the apocalypse by moving into a new integrated state of being. So Jung saw this as a transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And Jung predicted that regarding the age of Aquarius, this would be the grand finale to his thoughts on the book of Job and the atomic age. And he viewed the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius not as astrology, but as a massive synchronistic shift in the collective unconsciousness, that we would move much more into this realm that we're in now.
And it seems to happen that way in the collective conscious and unconscious.
Right.
That as we go from age to age, there's that is expressed symbolically on a global level of our culture.
Right. You want to do this?
It's really interesting, I think. So the age of Pisces is what we're just coming out of, and that was said to correspond with the age of the Christ archetype. There's the 2 fishes that symbolize that. Jung noted that the age of Pisces, which is a fish, roughly 0 AD to the year 2000 AD, was symbolized by 2 fishes swimming in opposite directions. The Great Spirit, Jung interpreted this as the era of extreme dualism. Christ versus Antichrist, spirit versus matter, good versus evil. And the one-sidedness, the first millennium was the first fish, was the rise of the Christian ideal of pure light. The second millennium, the second fish, saw the inevitable return of the opposite, the rise of materialism, the shadow, and eventually the atomic power of the 20th century. The conclusion, for Jung, the Job-like suffering of the modern era was the result of this tension between the 2 fishes reaching a breaking point.
So now we go to the age of Aquarius, which is what we just started.
Then the 2 fish are swimming in the water that the water bearer is pouring out of its pitcher, his pitcher. As we transition into the age of Aquarius, the symbol changes from animals, which a lot of zodiac symbols are, to a human figure, the water bearer pouring water. The humanization of God, just as Job's consciousness forced God to become human, the Incarnation, Jung believed the age of Aquarius represents the
continual incarnation.
Okay. The divine power is no longer projected to a distant God, but is poured into the human individual. The responsibility of the individual, in Aquarius, the water, the energy of the unconscious, the divine, is handled by, I would say, directed by a human. This means humanity can no longer blame God's will or fate for its disasters. We are now the containers of that power.
So we shift from the Trinity to the Quaternity. The new age of Aquarius for Jung was the era where the Quaternity finally replaces the Trinity. This is the age where the feminine, the assumption of Mary, and the dark, the shadow, and Satan are integrated into a single complex image of the self. This is what Jung called individuation, the synthesis of science and spirit. Jung hoped in this new cycle, the atomic or the Pauli's physics side of things and the archetypal or Jung psychology would no longer be seen as separate, but as two ways of understanding the same world clock. I would say we're still not there, but it's not that far-fetched what he's talking about. There's a danger of transition. Jung warned that transitions between these cosmic ages are always catastrophic because the God image must die for the new one to be reborn. So the Platonic year here, Jung calculated these shifts based on the precession of the equinoxes, which are cycles of roughly 2,150 years. And he believed that the mid-20th century was the collision point between the two ages. So we either undergo a moral evolution, as Job did, to carry the divine water responsibly, or we succumb to the wrathful side of the transition, which is the apocalypse of Revelation. It's our choice. Do you want to carry the water, or do you want to fry in a nuclear fireball? So the great transition here, the feature, we have Age of Pisces, which is we've just left, and we're just going into the Age of Aquarius. So we have as a symbol for it, the Age of Pisces has two fishes going in opposite directions. The Age of Aquarius is a water bearer, which is humanity bearing water. The structure here in the Age of Pisces was the Trinity, which was spiritual and very dualistic, good and evil. But for the Age of Aquarius, it's this quaternity. It's including the feminine and the shadow side of things. With the material, so the material and the holistic are all in part in the quaternity. We have the locus of power. In the Age of Pisces, it was an external god or fate. In the Age of Aquarius, it's the internal psyche or responsibility. And this leads to the conflict in the Age of Pisces between Christ and Antichrist. In the Age of Aquarius, it's the integration of the shadow to the conflict here. So Jung's final answer to Job is ultimately a call to individuation. He believed the Age of Aquarius is the age of the individual. So if enough people can hold the tension of their own light and dark, carrying their own water, then the shadow of God manifest in the atomic age becomes not a weapon of destruction, but the fuel for a new level of human consciousness. And maybe that'll come to pass. Jung had a map of the soul. His unified map of the soul for the modern person is a synthesis of all of these threads, moving from the ancient foundations of reality to a scientific and spiritual responsibility for the future. Get this out of the way. The map begins with the realization we don't live in a random world, just as Plato's theory of forms suggests there's an eternal blueprint for all things, or the algorithms that Ron Cowan saw. Jung identifies archetypes as universal patterns of the collective unconscious. These are internal forms that shape our dreams, our myths, and our behaviors. So the archetypes are really these Platonic forms. But the conflict here is we have the moral evolution of Job. The middle of the map explores the divine drama of consciousness. So Jung uses the book of Job to show that human suffering is not meaningless, but it's a catalyst for God's own evolution. So by standing his ground, Job forced the divine, the unconscious, to become self-aware. You are unconscious. Now you're aware. Here's a mirror. Let me show you why you're messing up. And you transition from a blind, amoral force into a conscious participant in human history, which is where we hope we would end up with. The crisis that precipitates this is this atomic age, and of course, the shadow. The shadow of God falls into human hands. With the atomic age, humanity possesses the divine power of destruction, but lacks the moral consciousness to handle it. So the burden of carrying God's unresolved opposites, good and evil, light and dark, shifts from the heavens to the individual soul. Huge responsibility. We have the integration of synchronicity in the world clock. The map structure integrity is provided by the collaboration between Jung and Pauli. The unus mundus, the one world, there they propose that mind and matter are two sides of the same reality. And the world clock here, Pauli's dream of the world clock, serves as a map, as the map's compass. It represents a symmetrical order where the individual is the observer, but is also a supporter of cosmic harmony. And the destination, of course, is the age of today, the age of Aquarius, the era of individuation. So to go from twinity to quaternity, wholeness is achieved by integrating the missing fourth, the feminine, the body, the shadow, and the conscious individual. This modern person's task is to contain the water, the divine energy, without being consumed by it, to turn the fire of the atom into the light of consciousness. So we end up with yet another table. We have Platonic forms, the Book of Job, the atomic age, and the world's clocks, and then the age of Aquarius, all of these things here. So let's look at them one by one. For source and context, Platonic forms were the basis for ancient philosophy. Here, the role in this modern map is the eternal universal blueprints. They're still there, but they provide blueprints now for what is going on. The Book of Job in the ancient world was just a biblical myth. But here in this map, it's a shift from blind power that God had to human moral reflection. It's not a myth anymore. It's something that you have to actually deal with. The atomic age here occurred in the 20th century. And the role in this map is the externalization of the shadow of God. We finally have brought hellfire to earth. The world clock is Pauli's dreams. And this is the source. Dreams were always there back in history, but the role on the map is the symbol of cosmic order and psychophysical unity. That's what Pauli was trying to express here, that where we're heading for is cosmic order. And the age of Aquarius is really future consciousness. This is the era where the individual carries the divine burden of bringing it all together. So there you have it.
No, don't. Hang on.
You want to go back?
I want to go online.
You want to go online?
Yes.
You are online.
To Google.
Oh, to Google. Okay, hold on. Here you are. What do you want to do?
Here. Oh. Well, there's
okay. So now
simple here. Image of it.
Yeah, let's hear. Let me put this up on the screen.
But I want to get.
There you go.
All right. There's the one that's on the cover of their.
Yeah, let's let Bruce see it. What? Hold on.
What happened to it?
I don't know. Go back. Go.
It says I can't.
Here. Hold on. I'm going to get it for Bruce. Here it is, here. Okay. We can show you this, Bruce. Hold on a second.
Now I want to get the color image that's on the cover of the book.
Okay, there's the picture here, Bruce. Just a sec. I know where. I'm just going to go to Google Images. Okay. Hold on. Let me show you this. You got a bunch of pictures here.
Go to the book cover. You should be able to find that.
Here's a picture here, picture here. These are in color. This thing here kind of gets across the compartmentalization. You want to go to the Amazon to get the book?
Yeah. Just keep looking. Well, I don't know why they buried it, but yeah, let's try that.
Okay.
Oh, here's an image of it. There.
There we go.
That is the cover of the book. Now, what happened to it?
It's there.
Yeah. But I wanted to blow it. All right, here. All right, if we do that, there.
You see that, Bruce?
Yeah.
So this is his world clock, Adam and Archetype. This is the book they wrote together. Synchronicity is what Jung wrote.
Interesting.
These are they had, I want to say, 90 odd letters.
1932 to 1958. So that wasn't.
No, it was, he died in 58.
Okay.
The last letter was in 57. This is, anyway. And they started in 1930, but Pauli always was big on letters. He liked to write stuff down.
He didn't publish in the standard way that
he would like write letters on some topic to somebody, and that would be the definitive work on it, but would never be published.
But people would duplicate them,
yeah,
and send them around, and they would be pages and pages. They would be, like a formal essay that he just sent to somebody that wrote something that prompted him to write this.
So there you go. There's the world clock.
Like this.
And you can see it's supported by this bird. And it's got these entities on the horizontal ring. And they decided to put on the vertical ring, you can see what time it is. So there is
4 sectors.
Yeah. So there's a different world clock put together by the Union of Atomic Scientists, and it shows how much time we have until nuclear war will occur.
The doomsday clock.
Yeah, and so there have been times when it got to be like 1 minute to when all hell was going to break loose, and then they would say, okay, things have cooled down. So we got 5 minutes, and so they would publish this clock regularly. So it's still floating around, but you have to go back into the 50s, and you're in school. We had these atomic drills we did. If atomic bomb went off, you had to get underneath your desk. I don't know what good that would do, other than to kiss your baby goodbye. That's about it. But
duck and cover.
Yeah, there was just a huge amount of fear when they saw the power. They saw what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with all these 100,000 people incinerated, and just under a second they're gone. And you're sitting there saying, well, that was the early bombs. We have stuff now that's hundreds of times more powerful. I mean, what in the world's going to happen to me? So you can see he's trying to capture the spirit of the time and saying that we've gone too far in this direction and you've got to balance it out. So anyway,
we're still here anyway.
Yeah, I know we're still here. So
whatever it's worth.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought this was an interesting take on the book of Job to run through it. We've done other things with the book of Job, but this one has gone the farthest in this direction.
Right.
So, anyway, have a good weekend.
Okay.
And we'll see you next week. We're going to go back to Wednesday. We will be fine Wednesday going forward. Okay.
All right.
Have a good.
We
Bye-bye.